Welcome all to the Brain Health and Wellness Initiative series. Tonight, our presenter is Dr. Dennis Grossman, and he is discussing dementia and the divided brain, understanding brain's communication areas and its impact on dementia. My name is Hannah Doles, and along with my colleague, Nicole Herbert-Hale, we provide care navigation within the JFSA Dementia Care Navigation Program. Our program establishes an empowering environment to help improve the quality of life of those who have dementia or at risk of developing dementia, all while helping family caregivers reduce the stress and burden that often occurs while caregiving. At JFSA, we understand the importance in working with our clients' strengths and applying a person-centered approach to care, which extends throughout our multidisciplinary team of geriatricians, nurses, social workers, and geriatric psychiatrists. Nicole and I meet our clients where they are at and develop individualized care plans that help produce solutions to presenting problems. From linking persons with dementia and their families with community resources to following them with their medical management, we are their point of contact for guidance as well as a listening ear. We consider the intersectionality of one's life when creating interventions that adhere to their biopsychosocial needs and experiences. So before we begin today, we will take questions at the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send us questions. Please refrain from using the chat button if possible. And again, we are recording this webinar tonight, so if you could please keep your audio and video off tonight, we would appreciate that, but we will take your questions through the Q&A feature. Please also note that JFSA will offer continuing education credits if you are interested in that. It will take 30 days from the date of your application, which you will get in the form of a survey in the next 1 to 2 weeks to issue your CE credits. Your CE certificate will be emailed to you at the email address you provided during registration. And that email address that you use to access the webinar must be the same one you are providing. It just helps us to know who the person is. So if you are unsure of the email you use to attend, check your original confirmation email or give Nicole and I a ring if you need to check that with us. A little bit about our speaker tonight. Dr. Grossman is a graduate of Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine with over 30 years experience in internal medicine. He has been on the staff of University Hospitals Bedford and Ahuja Medical Centers, Cleveland Clinic South Point, and Marymount Hospitals, as well as Metro Health Medical Center, and he was the former medical director here at JFSA and a clinical instructor at the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. For the past 30 years, Dr. Grossman has been interested in the effects of diet on chronic Western diseases and promoted plant-based diets and macrobiotic diets. Dr. Grossman believes that they play a key component in preventing and reversing some types of diabetes, hypertension, heart attack, heart disease, stroke, and degenerative joint diseases. Thank you for being with us tonight, Dr. Grossman.
Thank you, Hannah. Nicole. The topic that I chose is a little bit complex, but I'm going to try and make it as understandable as possible. We have two brains. We have a right and a left hemisphere. And what's key is that if we understand how these two halves operate and communicate with each other, we can get an insight into how dementia may be affected by the actions on these areas. Now, our two brains have two different perspectives of the world, and there's some overlap. But our left side of the brain, which really controls the right half of our body, is more of the practical part of the brain, the doing part. The right hemisphere is more of the big picture, intuitive, emotional part of the brain. But what's also important is that the two functions of the brain. One is that the brain processes information. But with that information, it also has to communicate between areas of the brain to get a total functioning brain. The neurons in our brain can be divided up by function, and the most simplistic division is that of gray matter and white matter. And gray matter comprises cells that process and store information. And they're primarily in the peripheral, the outer portion of the brain. The white matter is the connecting part, and it has long connecting fibers and short connecting fibers, and they communicate between areas of gray matter and between the hemispheres. Much of what is transmitted through the white matter is actually inhibitory, so that one side may inhibit what the other side is trying to process or activate. And that's kind of important as we develop. Communication is critical. So in order to function optimally, we've got to have both sides. They have to be functioning properly, but they also have to communicate with each other, share that information and analysis. The major components the major communication component is a channel between the hemispheres, and that's called the corpus callosum. It's a wiring bridge made up of hundreds of millions of fibers. When we see dementia, we can divide it into damage to areas and disconnection between areas. So brain function is really dependent on the brain properly functioning in areas that are needed, and that functioning be effectively communicated between these different areas of the brain. Dementia has been attributed to one or both areas of the following: either loss of function in critical brain areas, or loss of our ability to internally communicate between these critical areas of the brain. So these functional areas have been well mapped out for years, and there are names for them, there are areas for them. Here's a pictorial graph showing the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the limbic lobe, the occipital lobe, the brain stem, pituitary glands, and cerebellum. All of these are duplicated on both sides, and they have specific functions that operate the contralateral or opposite side of the body. The white matter, which I referred to, is that insulating wiring that goes between gray matter and between the two hemispheres of the brain. And if you look at this picture, you can see right in the middle, there's kind of a thick whitish area that communicates between the two hemispheres, which is called the corpus callosum, as I mentioned earlier. Now, to give you an analogy of how the brain might work, imagine that you're working in an office building, and that office building uses facial recognition to allow you to enter. So your facial features can be recorded by a sensor and then compared to a catalog of all the employees' faces. That would be right brain activity, specific identification. Once your face is matched with your stored image, then a signal is sent to unlock the door and let you in the building. That's the left brain activity. So the wiring which connects these two sensors and door locks is the corpus callosum, or the white matter area. There's another analogy that I like to use, which is simpler. And think about a pigeon who's pecking the ground, looking for grains of food amongst the gravel. So very specifically, that pigeon is using its left brain, trying to identify the difference between food and non-food. But at the same time, the right brain of the pigeon is actually thinking, oh, I better look up every once in a while because there could be a hawk that's flying overhead and I could be that hawk's dinner. So at the same time, two activities are going on and they're communicating with each other, because if that right brain sees something that it's suspicious, it's going to stop pecking at the ground and fly away. So those are the two areas that need to communicate with each other, but function differently. There's another term for this called attention, different types of attention. So you have attention that's very specific, looking for food, but then there's the larger attention of what's going on around you, making you safe, what's going to keep you safe. Two very different types of attention that go on at the same time. Dementia in the brain. I always say two heads are better than one, but only if they're connected to each other. When we lose white matter wiring, that connective piece, we are unable to communicate processed information between these areas of the brain. The loss of the white matter, especially in the corpus callosum, is independently correlated with dementia progression. And this has been shown with scans, with PET scans, MRIs. So when you hinder communication between hemispheres, you get an understanding that dementia is being affected, that dementia is at risk at that point. Tasking. So when we refer to the two hemispheres, we sometimes talk about the split brain effect, one hemisphere focusing on one task, the other hemisphere focusing on another task. The right hemisphere is usually involved in specific recognition, rhythms, spatial recognition, rhythms, and intuitive thought. And for most people, the left hemisphere is in charge of speech and language and very specific tasking. They communicate through the corpus callosum. The gross division of tasking allows for parallel processing of complex medical operations, such as language, social recognition, socialization. So why is the corpus callosum, this white matter structure, so critical? Well, when the communication between the two halves is diminished, we reduce our brain function substantially. When our right side is disconnected from the left, our ability to understand new information and view the big picture is lost. The left side is thus unable to use that information it has in a meaningful way. It's as though our brain is actually disconnected from the world about us. What damages white matter? And here's the critical part. It's a multifactorial process. Aging affects us, and it affects the white matter actually preferential to the gray matter. Inflammation, and I'll go into a little bit of detail on all these processes, but inflammation, disease processes, diabetes, hypertension, autoimmune diseases, vascular disease, which diminishes blood flow, resulting in low nutrient and oxygen supply. And the white matter specifically needs more blood flow than the gray matter, and that's been shown. And so it's actually the first to show some of the signs of poor nutrient and oxygen supply. Stress, creating high levels of adrenaline and cortisol, will also affect the gray matter and the white matter. Toxins, which we've seen in the past, heavy metals, and microbes, infectious processes. Also, abnormal sleep patterns. They directly affect the corpus callosum, and they also diminish our ability to clear toxins. So let's look at inflammation. Well, there's two areas of concern with inflammation. The first area is that it diminishes the ability of the two halves of the brain to communicate with each other via the corpus callosum. It has been shown that inflammation preferentially affects the white matter in these long fibers between the two hemispheres. They've shown this through looking at inflammatory markers in the blood that correlate with the shrinkage of the corpus callosum. So high inflammatory markers are correlated with decreased volume in the corpus callosum. But also inflammation affects the blood vessels, supplying the brain with the nutrients and oxygen, and it hinders its ability to clear toxins and waste products, so that inflammation itself will decrease the caliber, the size of the opening of the blood vessel, the ability of blood and oxygen to flow through it. And we've seen through MRI studies of inflammation that it affects the hippocampal memory areas, which are critical in terms of dementia. But also the corpus callosum is highly affected in states of dementia. The effects of inflammation. So the immune response keeps us safe. It's kind of like the ability for the pigeon to know that there's danger around. And this creates a generalized inflammatory response. It activates our autoimmune system. And for our protection, our immune system releases substances that cause increased blood flow, swelling, warmth, to counter any perceived foreign substance or insult. We've been able to measure one of the immune pro-inflammatory markers called tumor necrosis factor. Don't have to know that, but it's just a marker that we can measure, which assesses inflammations. And studies have shown that high tumor necrosis factor levels are associated with increased cell permeability in the corpus callosum, loss of density, and function. Western disease. And when I say Western disease, it's not just in the West, but it's our modern diseases that have become so prevalent. And one that I didn't really put in here, which we could add, is obesity. But diabetes, hypertension, autoimmune, vascular disease, these diseases have direct impact on brain function and white matter function through the inflammatory response that these diseases instigate. And they lead to white matter injury. Vascular disease also contributes to gray and white matter damage through lack of oxygens and nutrients. And so we're not getting the needed precursors that keep us operating, just like your car needs things to keep it operating properly. Stress. And again, this is part of the immune response, our ability to respond to danger, to stress. Stress-induced chronically elevated cortisol levels are associated with dementia. That's been well documented. Elevated cortisol levels lead to lower brain volumes, decreased gray matter in the frontal lobes, which is where we do a lot of our high-functioning processing, and also decreased white matter in the corpus callosum and other areas of the brain where there is white matter. I mentioned sleep, and there's been a lot of work about what sleep does, and it's been known that during non-REM sleep, we are able to remove toxins, especially amyloid, and that having the ability to have restful sleep helps clear things that are detrimental. But sleep deprivation and poor sleep quality has been linked to shrinkage and diminished function of the corpus callosum. So what can we do about this? What can be done? Well, the most critical part is minimizing inflammation in the body. And secondly, our automatic system, our autoimmune system, and its perception of stress, which activates the inflammatory response, needs to be mitigated. And there's three key factors to lessening adrenaline and cortisol levels, which are the autonomic nervous system's response to stress, especially chronic stress. And these three factors are diet, activity/exercise, and social connectivity. So let's talk about inflammation. There are many avenues to affect inflammation. First would be dietary choices. And there are a list of low inflammatory foods and how we prepare them that can decrease or increase inflammatory process. And a lot of that is through the gut, through the microbiome. It's kind of a complex process, but we have been studying this for many years and have come up with certain guidelines as to how to decrease the inflammatory response throughout the body. Exercise. Exercise lessens stress hormones. We've known that many different types of exercises can help to decrease cortisol levels and adrenaline levels. Relaxation, meditation, breathing exercises also will lower these stress hormones and lower the inflammatory response. And then, very important, the social connectivity with family, with friends, with community aids in lowering stress levels, being able to reach out to others in a meaningful way and feel as though we are not isolated. How do we strengthen the corpus callosum, the white matter? Anti-inflammatory foods play a role in strengthening this connection. Whole food, mainly plant-based, with phytonutrients and antioxidants. Avoidance of certain vegetable oils, not the vegetables themselves, but the processing of the vegetable oil in high concentrations. And I'm not sure how deep to go into this, but we have known that polyunsaturated fatty acids, which we see in vegetable oils, are really good for us. However, what's really important is the ratio of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. There's two main types. There's more than two, but the two main types are the omega-6 fatty acids and the omega-3s. You've probably heard of the omega-3s. They're in fish oil, flaxseed oil, seaweed, things like that. The omega-6s are more so in vegetable oils, things like that. And what's happened in the 20th century is we have elevated our ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s. So if you were eating as we did in the turn of the century, the 19th century, not the 20th century, your ratio would be about 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 of omega-6 to omega-3s. Now, in Western diets, we're at about 20 to 40-to-1. And it's that ratio of these two fatty acids that's critical. Omega-6s are pro-inflammatory. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. We need them both, but we need them in the proper ratio. Also, if we cook food at very high heat, deep frying for long periods of time, especially deep frying in oils that have been used over and over again, i.e. going to McDonald's and getting their French fries, which probably haven't changed their fryer for a while, you're going to change the consistency of these oils. And lastly, but not leastly, is processed sugar. which creates inflammation through high insulin levels. So this has been added to our diet, and I'm sure people are well aware of how much more sugar we consume nowadays as we did 50 years ago. So what about exercise? Are there things that the corpus callosum can benefit from? And you can utilize both sides of the brain and enhance the connectivity between the two hemispheres. Bilateral brain activity, one of the hallmarks are balance exercises, things that activities and exercises that you can learn that make you utilize both sides of the brain. Eye-hand coordination skills, playing things like ping pong, pickleball, tennis, soccer, throwing and catching balls using both sides of both hands. Juggling, if you're talented, is a marvelous exercise I've never been able to master. Things like rhythmic exercises, dancing, martial arts, yoga, tai chi, and then also music through either playing instruments or singing, chanting. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that those activities utilize both sides of the brain and strengthen the corpus callosum and the white matter. Additionally, using the non-dominant hand. So in activities that you use the non-dominant hand, it actually fortifies the white matter in your brain. What's interesting is that if you're right-handed, your right hand is actually only about 10% stronger than your left hand and vice versa. So it's not that big a difference, but we tend to use fine motor movement and skills through that dominant hand, but using both hands actually is beneficial. Playing instruments using both hands, exercises that use both hemispheres. And here's a couple, it's hard to picture this, but there's something called floor movement crawling, using opposite upper and lower body movements. Bird dog, it's a picture of a bird dog exercise. The dead bug exercise, where you lay on your back looking like a dead bug. Cross crawling. And as I said before, balance exercise. And bicycle riding is quite interesting because unbeknownst to the rider, you're doing balancing all the time. In fact, when you get on a bicycle, what you're doing is pretty much falling from one side to the other, but through your body's correction, you're able to stay up based on exercising that balance mechanism by utilizing both sides, the muscles on both sides, riding that bicycle. Not so with a stationary bike, I must say. So, strengthening the right hemisphere. So, as I said before, the right hemisphere is more the big picture. And there are studies that have shown that mindfulness techniques, such as meditation, actually strengthens the right side of the brain. The reason why I say that is that in modern society, what has happened is that the left side of the brain has gotten bigger. The right side hasn't gotten smaller. It's just become the non-dominant hemisphere. And what happens is we become a little bit too left-sided, always task-oriented, always looking at the fine details and not being able to look at the big picture. The right side of the brain is actually utilized in connecting, in socialization, in being able to sort of identify things as being faces and familiar places, things like that. All of these things improve the corpus callosum thickness with these mindful practices. And these have been well documented with MRI scans after people have practiced mindfulness, things like that, meditation. So here's something I throw in, and I'm not sure I should have, but anyway, there's a yogic pranayama breathing exercise. It says left nostril, but actually both nostrils can be practiced. But the left nostril breathing, where you breathe in through the left nostril, out through the right nostril, actually reduces the levels of stress hormones, activating the parasympathetic or rest and relax system in your brain. It increases blood flow to the right side of the brain, the contralateral opposite side, which is the side that we don't use as much. Alternating nostril breathing also increases the activation and activity of the connection, the corpus callosum. So, and again, these are sort of a little bit esoteric, but there are ways that you can improve your right brain function and your connectivity. Social connectivity. Spending time with family, with friends, with coworkers reduces dementia risks, well known at JFSA, and increases longevity. Social interaction exercise cognitive skills such as memory, language, speech. The more we exercise these skills, the greater is our cognitive reserve. And one of the things that we have known is that if you have more cognitive reserve, you will have less, dementia will have less impact on you. Education is another thing that increases your cognitive reserve. So always learning or trying to learn a new skill, or whether it's trying to play an instrument or learn a language or a new game or activity, all these things actually increase your cognitive reserve and improve your ability to fend off cognitive decline. So, in summary, how has the brain shaped our world? Well, the brain has shaped our world because we have to be able to put everything in context. We can identify things, but we also have to put it in context as to the bigger picture. And as we age, stress, inflammation, and disease states compromise this ability to engage both hemispheres. Our task is to maintain this white matter structure that is both internal and external to the hemispheric communications. And by doing so, we actually will minimize our cognitive decline. These are two books that I kind of drew on heavily. And this is a neurologist who wrote about the divided brain and its ability to organize and perceive the world as that we live in and allow us to function in a way that is optimal. And I will open this up to questions, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity. I hope it wasn't too esoteric or complicated.
Thank you very much.
It's a complicated situation.
Yes. Well, the brain is very complex, and you have to see how it all works together. So we thank you for that. We'll take any questions now. So again, if you want to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, I will take questions. So I do have a question already. Do we understand what accounts for the loss of emotional control seen in some dementia patients?
So I believe some of that has to do with the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex. And there is some thinking that it's damage, but there's also some thinking that it's disconnect. It's actually white matter not being able to connect that part of the brain with the rest of the brain. So there's two theories, but emotional lability is really a higher functioning in the frontal part of the brain, which we develop as, in our 20s. And it is something that goes in dementia, is affected by dementia. And I believe a lot of that is due to white matter problems.
Thank you. Can brain scans show the true breakdown of white matter in the brain?
Yes, because white matter is quite different than gray matter. It's actually has very high percentage of fat in it. And that is actually easily picked up by scans because they go by density, and fat is less dense than the neurons, the gray matter area. And what's interesting is that we do need fat in our diet. We need proper fat. People that are on extremely low fat diets, I think, are in some ways jeopardizing or putting themselves at risk. So yes, we can easily identify these structures through scans.
Okay. Thank you. Is it too late to do some of these corpus callosum exercises with dementia patients in serious decline? Good question.
So that's a good question. I think you can do balance exercises. You probably can do some of the rudimentary exercises that use both sides of the body. Again, I think a lot of this is in people that are in earlier decline, get more benefit. So once there's damage, it's sort of hard to reverse some of that. And a lot of this has to do with some preventative measures. So I would say probably not as effective as you are in further decline.
Thank you.
I have a question. Would you say that swimming is another exercise that would utilize or exercise both sides?
Absolutely. Yes.
Mm.
Swimming, walking, walking is also, walking is balance. When you walk, what you're doing is you're loading the right side, then loading the left side. You're momentarily balancing. It may not be as evident, but you're actually utilizing both sides and going back and forth. You're falling, minuscule falling, but then you get your balance back. You put your other foot down. So those are in swimming. Again, you're, depending on how much you do, you certainly would benefit from anything that uses both sides at the same time.
What kind of testing can be done to determine if there are issues with the right or left hemispheres of the brain other than scans?
So there are actually tests that test certain functions that are primarily left side or right side, having to do with language, having to do with problem solving. A lot of problem solving is right-sided brain activity. And there were some exquisite studies that were done back in the 60s and 70s where back then, when people had intractable epilepsy, they would do a procedure where they would cut the corpus callosum, and they could then visually input just to one side of the brain and ask them if they saw this, or ask their hand, what do you have in your hand? And the one side not communicating with the other would either recognize it if it was a side that had language, or not recognize it. What was interesting, one of the things was they would put something in the left hand, and because language is on the left side, they'd ask the person what that thing was. The person wouldn't know the words for it, but they would ask them, they would give them a choice. And if they got the wrong choice, they'd shake their head. And then the right side, because the right side of the brain, which got the input from the hand, would no, that's not right. And then the left side would actually speak, well, say, oh, that's wrong. No, that's not it. So there are alternative ways of communicating, but yes, and there are visual tests that they can do, but there's mostly the tests that they do to determine right and left side have to do with problem solving for the right side, and more task oriented things for the left side of the brain. Counting, quantifying, things like that.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions here. Does it hurt our brain functioning to get exposed to extreme negativity through hearing about mean-spirited politics or having to live in a dangerous neighborhood?
Well, sure. So anything that increases your stress levels, increases your cortisol levels, has been shown to affect the hippocampus. That's a memory area. And it's also been known to affect the white matter. So yeah, if you're always exposing yourself to things that upset you, that irritate you, and it's not so much that irritate or affect you, it's that you can't do anything about, and you sort of you feel like you're trapped and you're cornered, whatever. Those increased stress levels. That's fight or flight, whatever. So yes, all those things are not good. And in this society, we're barraged by it. It's a daily thing. And in some ways, we perpetrate it on ourselves because we tend to, it stimulates us in some strange way. And not a good way, but we sort of get addicted to that. So don't listen to the debates, and don't
Yes.
whatever you.
Yes, maybe take a break from all the
Maybe take a break.
news. Someone did ask, the medications that are out there to maintain cognition and memory, how long do they really work for a person? Can you kind of talk about some of the studies that are out there on those medications?
Specifically, I don't know how long. They certainly work for years. Most of those medications have to do with improving neurotransmitters. And because there's a deficiency in the neurotransmitters. So I think after a while, they lose their effectiveness. This may take years. There's a new drug out that supposedly FDA has approved that there's been a lot of debate over, that decreases the amyloid, sort of cleans up the amyloid. There's been a lot of questions as to whether that is helpful. They say it might be helpful in early dementia, but there are a lot of side effects, and it's very expensive. And we don't have any long-term studies. So, but yes, most of the medications effectiveness wears off after several years, I'm sure. I'm not a gerontologist, neurologist, so they would probably give you a better idea of the true length of that, but there is some diminution over time.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll take one more question for this evening. Someone did ask if Alzheimer's disease is genetic, or both her father and her sister had the disease in their late 80s, early 90s.
So there is a identified gene, ApoE4, that increases your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's. I think if you have one relative, well, one parent that has that gene, you have 3 times the risk, and if you have both parents, it's 9 times the risk. So yes, there is some heredity involved in that, but in response to that, we also have seen that one of the highest incidence of ApoE4 is in I believe a country called Ghana, or it's an African country. And in that country, they are mostly vegetarian, and they have a low incidence of Alzheimer's disease. So there may be some mitigation with diet. It certainly is a higher predisposition, but even with that, there are things that can mitigate it through lifestyle. So yes and no.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all your time with us tonight, Dr.
Thank you.
Grossman.
Pleasure.
If there are any more questions about tonight's presentation, feel free to reach out to Nicole or myself. Again, we are care navigators that work with clients in the community. So if you have someone that you would like to refer to our program, a family member, a friend, we do help people. The goal is to keep people at home as long as possible. And we're often referring clients to various resources within JFSA and in the community to do just that. We have 2 geriatricians that work with us, Dr. Elizabeth O'Toole and Dr. Constance Magulius. They come here to our JFSA clinic, our Allison's Place clinic at our building. So if, Nicole and I will work very closely with them to put any supports in place for clients. Frank Petrelli is our general psychologist, so he will do the initial dementia assessment testing. Pamela Lynch is also part of our team. She is definitely someone who's present during our support groups, and she is our facilitator for our Caregiving with Confidence workshops. Leanne Stuver is a health educator, and she also joins us for our brain health and wellness workshops. So we do have a support group that we offer the 2nd and the 4th Mondays of the month. We also offer our Caregiving with Confidence workshops, like I mentioned. We do offer those throughout the year, and we do have another series coming up after Labor Day. So we do have slots available if people would like to join. And if you have interest, please let us know. We have these presentations as well as our supportive home care program. Next month, Leanne Stuver will be with us on September 28th at 6:30. She'll be discussing the connection between sleep, brain health, and dementia. So again, if there are any questions, our contact information is listed there. And we thank you all so much for attending on this beautiful evening tonight. Take care, everybody.